Good afternoon and early evening for those who are attending the virtual 2020 MENA Think Tank Summit in a world disrupted and transformed. I want to thank the Planning Committee, the MENA Summit Planning Committee, the chairs, and all the panelists. And as many of you know, the TTCSP operates without a budget or a full-time staff. And since this is the final summit for 2020, I want to thank the interns whose shoulders I stand on and work diligently to help make these programs possible. A special thanks to Emma Harris, Elisa Wadsworth, Ben Costco, Elijah Fullerton, and other interns who have helped work on this project, especially the MENA research team. This is, as I said, the last summit for 2020. Since April, we have hosted 3 global town halls to save lives and livelihoods. We have 9 months into the crisis, hosted 7 regional summits, 1 global summit, 1 all-China summit, and 1 summit to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. Each and every one of these programs are designed to highlight the role that think tanks are playing in a time of crisis, and to feature on a regional and global basis think tanks around the world that are on the front lines with ideas and actions to save lives and livelihoods. In just a few weeks, we will release, also with the purpose in a time where facts and evidence and science are being questioned, a 2-volume set with 64 think tank presidents who will ponder the question, the future of think tanks and policy advice. On January 28th, we will launch the 15th edition of the Global Go-To Index, and more importantly, a global session on why think tanks matter in a time of crisis. Today, the focus of the program is in 5 sessions. The first will assess on in each and every one of the 7 regional summits, have assessed the impact of COVID on the region. And the opening session today will do the same, and will focus on assessing the impact of COVID in terms of social, economic, political, and of course, public health on the MENA region. The second session will provide, with an excellent group of scholars and senior staff from think tanks, on responses, concrete proposals and actions that think tanks have taken in the region to respond to the COVID crisis. The third session will focus on, actually it's the 4th session because this is the first session, what think tanks need to do to survive and innovate so that they can continue to serve the citizens and countries where they are located. The 4th session will look at and explore the possibility, similar to the period at the end of the Middle Ages that ushered in the Renaissance, and as a result of the catastrophic implications of the Black Plague in Europe, whether a similar period will be ushered in terms of the Middle East and in other regions of the world. Certainly, we have seen in each of the areas identified in the opening session, catastrophic failures, but also states that have innovated and responded effectively to the crisis. The final session will look at the T20 and other international bodies and their ability to respond to the crisis, to sustain the G20 and global agenda, but more importantly, to engage and to be more inclusive in terms of regions of the world like the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia. The reality and the simple reality is that the T20 and the G20 continue to be dominated, both in terms of the think tanks that participate and the institutions, both private and public, continue to be dominated by participants, policy briefs, etc., from Europe and North America and the US specifically. And so the hope is to reform these institutions during this period of Renaissance so that they are more responsive and inclusive. So without further ado, I now like to invite Paul Tamim, who is the president of the Middle East Institute in Washington, to chair a session that I term the invisible black swan, how COVID-19 has changed the world. And an excellent panel will provide an assessment of the impact on the MENA region. Paul?
Thank you, Jim. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. And I want to start by thanking you, Jim, for all you do and all you've done with your amazing team over the years to work with and nurture think tanks all over the world, including the Middle East and North Africa. So thank you for that life's work, Jim. You've really made a difference in the world. Indeed, this has been obviously among many exceptional years, another exceptional year for the Middle East. First, a comment on the term, the invisible black swan. It is an invisible crisis in terms of it being a virus, but I wouldn't say it's a black swan in the sense that it was unpredictable. This is maybe one of those white swans where it was not unknown among people who follow public health and epidemiology that these types of things are likely to happen. What was unpredictable was when. I think the important takeaway from this is that this experience that the Middle East and indeed the world is going through is something that's likely to happen again, maybe in slightly different forms. So the silver lining is lessons we learned today in terms of preparedness, response, early detection, policy management, and then building to recovery are hopefully lessons we can use certainly, hopefully for other pandemics, but maybe for also other kinds of systemic crises, whether they're climate related or something else. So there are certainly policy lessons to be learned. We have an amazing panel today of colleagues and friends from around the Middle East leading excellent think tanks. And those I'll introduce briefly. My good friend Maha Yahya, who is the director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Lebanon. I believe she's currently in Antwerp, Belgium, and feeling a little bit under the weather, and I dare say somewhat related to the topic of this panel and this year. So she will be going first, and I don't know if she can stay on for the whole panel, but I wish her the best. And then Mr. Nader Kabbani, Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Institute in Qatar. Nader also previously headed the Syrian Center for Policy Research, so obviously knows much about the GCC and Syria. Dr. Güven Sak is the Director of the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, TEPAV, joining us from there. And I'm not sure our friend Dr. Iman Ragab is on yet, but she is also to join us on this panel. She's a senior researcher from Cairo at the Al-Ahram Center for Political and Strategic Studies. She's also an adjunct professor at the American University of Cairo. So we've asked our panelists to take 4 or 5 minutes each, talk about obviously the dynamics of the pandemic itself in their country or sub-region. How has the public health system responded? Obviously, it varies country by country. What has the public health response been? What is the basic government policy and response been, both in terms of shutdowns and lockdowns, and then certainly as relates to social policy and economic policy, which then leads to the question of impact on the economy. Obviously, there's generally been contraction in economies around the world, and that's also the case in most of the Middle East and North Africa. Indeed, the only country measuring positive growth is Egypt, interestingly enough. And the pandemic in the Middle East also came with a collapse of oil prices, which in some countries was a double whammy for their economies, particularly the oil exporting companies. We've also asked our panelists to comment on the social impact. Obviously, in most cases, rise in poverty and unemployment, but also a bit of focus on particularly vulnerable groups, women heads of households, internally displaced peoples, refugees, and so on. And the impact on domestic politics, more repression, less repression, protests, in some cases have scaled back because of a hesitation to get into big groups and maybe obsession with other things. And finally, a few comments on regional politics, how it's affected conflict zones and the regional politics itself. We've seen a continuation of conflict in the civil wars of Yemen, Syria, Libya. But on the other hand, we've also seen the outbreak of peace agreements between a number of Arab countries and Israel. And finally, ending with perspectives on 2021. How does it look in terms of when the pandemic, as it ebbs, inshallah, how does that country look poised to move on, to recover? So without further ado, let me go first to Dr. Maha Yahya. Over to you, Maha.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jim. I echo Paul's words in thanking you for all the efforts you've done over the past few years, actually probably a decade, in pulling everyone together and putting the think tank industry up there and getting everyone to respond to a global crisis in so many different ways. I'm going to begin with a few words, and then I will stay on for most of the panel, but probably won't be able to join the rest of the conference. Paul, as you mentioned, many of the global challenges, the economic contraction, the health, the pressure on health systems, things that we're seeing globally have particular resonance in the MENA region. The MENA region is huge and is it varies very much from country to country. But some of the trends we're witnessing are that the changing nature of the global economy is going to impact the region. The end of the rentier state is already triggering a search for new economic opportunities. Most likely, this will accelerate the move towards artificial intelligence, technology-based employment opportunities, sectors that are new and where many of the workers in the region are not particularly skilled in. So this is likely to add to a worsening income distribution in the region. I mean, if we recall, in the global economic crisis of 2008, companies reduced employment and wages, which worsened the distribution of income worldwide. In our region, in the Middle East and North Africa, we're already seeing the ripple effects of this in a number of places, particularly in countries where states or governments and central banks don't have the fiscal space to be able to create fiscal stimulus to the economy. Places like Lebanon or Yemen, particularly conflict countries, or Iraq or Syria, etc. In terms of, in tandem to the worsening income gaps, we're also seeing, of course, increase in the gaps between the haves and the have-nots. The number of poor has expanded exponentially. The UN, for example, estimates that by 2021, 16 million people are projected to be in poverty, and an additional 9 billion will live on less than $1.9 per day. The disruptions in global supply chains have also mean greater food insecurity for a region, particularly countries that rely on imports rather than on exports. And we're seeing some of these disruptions in global supply chains have a direct impact on informal economies, because informal economies have also historically been quite globalized. So we're seeing this impact specifically in border areas, taking, for example, the town of Benguerdan in Tunisia, where that relies very much on informal supply chains of fuel, of tobacco, etc. And this has been significantly disrupted, which means people are without any income in a context where governments are not able, there's very little social protection mechanisms in place in a context of increasing social fragility. A similar context is that of Lebanon, where again, the lockdowns and all the associated measures with COVID has meant greater social fragility. There's also been a reversal in human development gains, and these will have downstream impacts, whether it's in education, for example, this is where it's most visible, collapsing health systems, etc. The number of children who are out of school or who were technically in school but were not getting much of an education, because educational systems across the region, or particularly again in the Levant and North Africa, are not really set up for distance learning, whether it's through hardware, access to internet, or whether through the actual training of teachers and students to do online training. Finally, I'll say a couple of words about how the COVID-19 has also been an opportunity for greater repression in some countries, the use of technology to monitor, but the use of actually COVID to keep people away from the streets. My sense is that once the restrictions related to COVID-19 are lifted, we're likely to see a new wave of protests across different countries in the region, particularly since the reason why they went to the street to begin with in 2011 have still not been continue to be unaddressed. And actually the fragility, the socioeconomic fragility that they were complaining about in 2011, that they were protesting against, has been accentuated further and further. Finally, one last word about conflict countries. COVID-19 has hit them particularly badly. They are the health systems in countries like Syria, which had already collapsed more or less prior to the conflict. We're seeing different parties to the conflict in Syria, for example, utilizing the COVID-19 pandemic for different ends. In government-held territories, there's been significant misinformation campaigns. In other areas, the restrictions on cross-border aid, the shutting down or restriction of cross-border aid to one crossing by the UN Security Council has impacted the delivery of aid to areas that are not under government control. So it has had a significant impact in a number of conflict countries. And it's been an exponential one. Meanwhile, the rate of infection is really running unchecked in places like Yemen and Syria and others. I'll stop right here.
Thank you.
If you want the Q&A, Paul, I can talk a bit more about the moving forward and what could be done. Some ideas about.
Thank you, Maha. That was really a very insightful and thought-provoking, tour d'horizon a bit about some of the effects in some of the sectors. Let me turn to our good friend Nader Qabbani, joining us from outside of his camping ground, I believe. Is that correct, Nader?
It's a beautiful setting.
Yes, Paul. Yes, Paul. Thanks, Jim. It's Friday here. It's the weekend, and because it's the Gulf, the weather is beautiful, and we're out camping. So I apologize for the background, but it's actually pretty nice and beautiful out here. Just let me thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jim, and Emma Harris, and all the team at the Think Tanks and Civil Societies program at UPenn for putting this together. I know we meet every year in different locations, and it's the first time we're doing this virtually. But I think it's a very important time to be doing this and to be sharing our thoughts on what's happening. I'm going to speak mostly about, I guess, the GCC, since this is kind of the sub-region where I'm at. And I mean, there's a lot of work here going on issues of COVID and governance. In fact, the Brookings Doha Center has been involved in leading MENA COVID governance project. I thought I'll focus on four main issues. First is in terms of governance and public health, the GCC has done remarkably well. They responded quickly to the pandemic. They did a fairly good job of balancing the need for lockdowns and kind of quickly managing how people interact in their societies. At the same time, they opened up the economy a little bit when it was possible, and managed to kind of balance the economic and public health dimensions of COVID. Even when we had extremely high rates of COVID infection, for the most part, fatality rates have been fairly low. Hospitals have not been overwhelmed with patients. And I think the GCC countries have shown that they can actually handle a situation like this reasonably well. Of course, it's a difficult situation overall, but overall on the governance side, I think they did a decent job. The GCC economy countries are struggling a bit more when it comes to the issue of the economies. As Paul mentioned, they got hit with a double whammy. First, there was a lockdown and reduced economic activity, like all the countries in the world. At the same time, oil prices fell quite dramatically, back to around $50 per barrel. But this is still below the fiscal break-even point for most GCC countries, which means that they're struggling with the revenues, with the weak revenues that is being generated by oil and natural gas.
Nadir, if I may, we're having a bit of a problem hearing you. Your voice is cutting out. I might maybe suggest if you turn off your video, you might get more bandwidth for your audio.
Okay. So my video is off. Okay. So generally, the countries are managing reasonably well. But is this better, Paul?
I believe it is. Proceed. We can.
Okay.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm outside, so this is probably what's going on. So basically, just to put the economic situation in perspective, GDP is expected to decline by around 6% across the region. And very importantly, the government and the GCC are running deficits around 9% on average. Actually, this is just on average. Some countries are suffering a lot more in terms of their deficits. But the countries doing the short run have been focusing on cost-cutting measures, which is kind of what they need to do. They need to kind of make sure that they cut what they can. But the picture is not to cut away the fundamentals of their kind of economic move from a hydrocarbon economy to a more diversified economy. In fact, that's the main area they need to be focusing on, is prioritizing more economic diversification as well as regional integration. And this is still an area that GCC economies are struggling with. On the political side, I think the solid public health response to the pandemic has reinforced the political stability within the GCC countries. Now, geopolitically, there's some issues because the pandemic has placed additional pressures, enormous pressures on Iran. The situation in Yemen is teetering on the edge of famine, and many other countries are struggling. And this has probably long-run geopolitical implications for how the GCC is going to be dealing with kind of the overall regional politics. that's going to emerge from the pandemic. There's definitely going to be pressures towards greater dialogue and hopefully reduced conflict, as Maha suggested. In fact, that's hopefully, we can be optimistically hopeful that this is an opportunity to do that. On the social side, I think the main...
2 minutes remaining.
Sorry?
That was Jim being 2 minutes remaining. Jim.
No, I'll just take a minute then. So on the social side, I think by and large the main impact from here has been kind of the effect of the pandemic and the response on migrant workers and people who are not citizens of the region. The cost cutting has more affected non-citizens. This has implications for their being able to find jobs, returning to their home countries. Remittances have declined significantly. And many countries in the region rely heavily on remittances from workers in the GCC. And obviously this is also going to affect investment that GCC countries make in other Arab countries, as well as development assistance. So I think the social implications are mostly like ripples that are going to be affecting the region at large, not just as GCC, from the GCC.
Thank you, Nadir.
Thank you. And we can discuss other points later.
Thank you, Nadir, for that view of the GCC. Moving right along to Dr. Güven Sak from Turkey. Güven?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. And thanks, Jim, for this devoted effort to increase the visibility of think tanks everywhere, all around the world. Let me start with a confession. Being in the think tank business, as far as I remember, there is no pandemic in the top 10 list of any institutions around the world in the last 4 to 5 years, as far as I remember. So this is something, a truly global situation, truly global problem that emerged and caught all of us unaware. And before the pandemic, we already have many global mega trends. There is the climate change agenda, new technological revolution continuing, disrupting our lives. There is demographic transition, aging populations in the north, and also youth bulge in the south, with all the related problems and rising global inequalities everywhere. Now I think with the pandemic, everywhere we are in a situation where the context of these problems have changed a little bit. They are all more intensified. They all become more global. When this problem becomes more global, there is the need now to find a global solution why G20 becomes more important and why T20 also becomes much more important. Let me go over a little bit, how the context has changed. We have a sudden stop in economic activity everywhere. Not only, revenues declined due to oil prices, decline in oil prices, tourism revenues, everything has declined. And lack of social protection mechanisms, especially in our region, in our countries, become much more visible. And also what we are now seeing in Turkey, rapid digitalization, robotization process that's going on in the industrial activities. And not only we have rising unemployment now, there is also a potential increase in the unemployment that we are expecting. There is this move towards gig economy, so lack of protection among the working population is going to become an imminent, much more important issue. You look at the global inequalities. Of course, the social cohesion issues are becoming much more important. In Turkey, we have around 3.6 million Syrian migrants, so it's kind of, with rising unemployment, it's kind of a competition between the ones who are already living here, who have been already here, and who have come here anew. That's also developing. And health system response up until now is working, but you feel the strain in the whole system. And when I look at the situation, I mean, it is possible to see this global problem everywhere, but I think there is a difference between developing and developed countries that we are seeing in terms of the impact. It is much easier for the developing countries, especially in these, monetary easing conditions and with fiscal space available. It's much easier for developing countries to cope with these trends. But I think it is harder, and it is going to become more harder for the developing countries to deal with, although we do not have yet demonstrations and other things, but the negative economic impact is already very much visible on the political scene when you look at the surveys. And so the people are feeling it, and that's why the politicians are also feeling it. So at this scale of a global problem, I think we need a global solution, and we need G20 to be more active if these multilateral response mechanisms in the near future are going to be still on the scene and important for all of us. That's why I think there is the need for T20 and more talk regarding, more exchange on the policy experiences. Our countries is becoming much more important. I think it is important that developing countries need some special attention, because I used to, when I look at the G20 activities, G20 meetings, I used to think that, in 2008, during the financial crisis in the United States, G20 saved the world by the help of the developing countries. So we helped the developed countries to continue the operation of the global market at that time. But now I think with this pandemic, it is becoming more important for G20 to look for developing countries, especially for our region also at the same time, because development is first and foremost organizational capacity, first of all. And, in our region, I'm now finishing. This organizational capacity is not very much developed in our region, and also borrowing capacity of firms and governments are much higher in the developed countries, but not in our part of the region as far as I see. So let me stop here.
Thank you, Güven, and thank you for emphasizing the necessity of a global response, the leadership of the G20 and T20, and how to respond to all of these challenges in our part of the world. Let me go to our concluding panelist, Dr. Iman Ragab, who's a senior researcher at the Al Ahram Center for Political Strategic Studies in Cairo, Egypt. Dr. Iman, good to see you, and the floor is yours.
Hi, Paul. It's nice to see you after our meeting in Cairo. I hope everything is okay at your side as well as at the side of my colleagues in this panel. Actually, I will focus in my contribution on how COVID-19 have impacted conflicts in the MENA region. And I will postpone my points regarding the future of these conflicts maybe to another round if there is time for it. I think what COVID-19 has done so far is that it increased the importance of building the capacity of different countries in the region to be more resilient in dealing with crisis in general, not only the health crisis, but also other type of crisis that it might encounter in the coming future. And I think investing in this dimension has been absent in the planning of many countries in the region, including these, the wealthy countries and countries that have a very good experience in planning and administrative management, including the GCC countries, Egypt, and maybe Tunisia and Algeria to an extent. And I think the unraveling importance of investing in this dimension may contribute to the general status of conflict in the MENA region, not only in the coming 3 years, but maybe in the coming 5 to 10 years. The second development that I think COVID-19 contributed to when it comes to the conflict in the region is that it paved the way for the continuation of many of the internal conflicts that many countries has been suffering from. The situation in Yemen, situation in Libya, as well as in Syria, is not telling that COVID-19 is leading to peace or durable settlement between the conflicting parties. And instead, I think it is leading to more deepening of the grievances and the socioeconomic drivers of the conflict that led to the eruption of the conflict at the beginning of the 2011 in particular. And I think the main reason of that is that the conflicting parties are not, during the COVID year, which is 2020, and maybe the first half of the 2021, did not lead to a high level of humanitarian losses and did not enable any of the conflicting parties to announce victory among the others. For that reason, the internal conflicts in these countries, I think, will continue to exist. It may have different nature, different aspect of intensity, but then at the end of the day, it will remain there. And COVID-19 will not lead to the settlement and the end of these type of conflicts.
2 minutes
the
remaining.
third development, excuse me?
2 minutes remaining, Iman.
Okay,
that was Jim.
Two points. Okay. The third development I think COVID-19 led to is that countries taking part in transnational conflicts tended to have this tactical understanding and tactical settlement. And maybe in the short term and medium term, this would lead to a level of confidence building between these conflicting countries. But at the end of the day, also it will not lead to the end of the conflict. The good example here is how Kuwait and UAE decided to help Iran, even though there are tensions and thorny issues between the three parties. They offered helping Iran through providing humanitarian aid and medical aid during the COVID year, but at the end of the day, this did not ended the conflicting issues between the three parties. The last development that I would like to share with you is regarding the role of violent non-state actors, and I think that COVID-19 just gave another aspect of the influence and the strength to these type of actors, and stressed their importance as parties in any future settlement of or negotiation for settling any of the conflicts, especially violent conflicts in the MENA region, in particular in Libya and in Syria. These violent non-state actors cannot be ignored by any of the regional or international actors, and they should be treated as equal parties in any negotiations. I think these are the main developments that has been created or fueled up by COVID-19 when it comes to the different conflicts that is going on in the MENA region. And I hope that the 2 minutes has ended. Thank you.
Thank you, Iman. Really, thank you for that look into the regional conflict dynamics of this year. We are out of time, and I want to thank Mahdi Yahya, Nader Qabbani, Guven Sak, and Iman Ragab for getting started on this session today, and give it back to good friend Jim.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to your excellent panel, which provided an excellent overview and an assessment of the impact of the crisis on the region. Many of the trends identified are in play and have been accelerated by the crisis. We now turn to a mandate for ideas and action in what I see as the pandemic, which we are all aware of, the unfortunate twin pandemic, which is the third wave of this crisis, and an economic crisis coming at the same time, and God forbid what I describe as a hydrodemic, where all of the political, social, economic, and public health crises converge at the same time. Clearly, this situation has accelerated trends that have been in play for some time, and we have discussed, and as Govind suggested, have been in play, and we have discussed at many of the previous summits. We now have an excellent panel to explore what is the central focus of these meetings, what think tanks are doing to demonstrate from the very beginning in April that think tanks are not only thinking but doing and providing ideas to address the crisis. Rim Ayadi, president of the Euro-Mediterranean Economics Association, is chairing the panel and will lead this discussion. Rim?
Thank you very much, Jim, first of all, for inviting me. And really, I would like to particularly thank you for the work, commitment, energy, and then all the team members that you have, who have been really very much active into really creating this dynamic within the global think tanks worldwide. So really great job, and I'm very happy to be here today. So it's very much my pleasure to chair this panel with leaders of think tanks in the MENA region, and also to discuss the ideas and actions to face this pandemic and whatever other consequences of the pandemic and any derivatives of it. So obviously, this pandemic has led to economic and social crisis in many parts of the world. We heard it already. And what is extremely worrying are also the uncertainties related to what is happening and what will happen in the months to come. So obviously, all of this is calling for bold policy mitigation actions, which in fact are happening in some parts of the world, for example, in Europe. And I think Europe has taken very bold actions on certain matters. But then what would be those policies and actions to deal with this long-term, we'll call it long-lasting pandemic and health crisis, and also worsening, most probably, the economic and social crisis in several parts of the world, particularly probably in MENA. And what should all these government and public would do? So yes, we have a great panel today. So let me welcome our three panelists. I see them on screen. Abla Abdellatif, who is the Executive Director and Director of Research at the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies in Egypt. Delaware Al-Din, who is a professor in the Middle East Research Institute in Iraq. I see that he is there. I don't see him, but let's see. Omar Obaidili, who is the Director of Research, Bahrain Center for Strategic International Energy Studies in Bahrain. So I would start with Abla. So all of you have, please, no more than 5 minutes for introducing the topic, and then we move a little bit into discussion. Please, Abla, the floor is yours. Or the screen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Reem. Hello, everyone. I want very quickly first to thank Jim and his team for all the efforts that have started from the beginning of the pandemic. He did a great effort that should be that is really applauded. And I've had the pleasure of joining the global think tanks big meeting at the beginning, and I'm glad that we're continuing with this. Whether we're talking about pandemic or twindemic or hydrademic, and the last one is actually a term that's created by Jim. You should have copyright for it, and I hope we never actually add it to the dictionary because it's very scary. Whether we're talking about either one of the three, there are three facts that that are very clear, that all three are rotating around health. Health is a primary thing. Two, that there is clearly a need for a strong economy to be able to survive the first level, the second level, or the third level. And three, there is a very serious need to pay attention to the poor and everything related to them, One, because they are seriously affected by the disease because of their conditions, but also because they're also a source of the spread of the disease because of their housing, because of their way of living, etc., especially in our part of the world. So these three areas need tackling, all right? And what I'm going to do is put suggestions for each one of them on priority areas in the region. When we talk about health, it's extremely important that public health policy is not looked at in an isolated way, but because actually it is a precondition for everything else. So practically and in reality, public health policy should be put as an integral part of economic policy and should be dealt this way by the governments in our countries. And this means special attention in government budgets, everything. Governments need to prepare for better health service provision for all. This is key, because without it, we cannot move forward. As far as the economy is concerned, a strong economy is definitely more capable of handling shocks, whether pandemic, twindemic, or hydrademic. Okay, and in order to achieve that, okay, there are things that need to be tackled, particularly in our region. The first one is the weakness in our economies. Okay, there are weaknesses that need to be corrected. These weaknesses are not new and did not emerge out of COVID-19. They have always been there. They just became clearer and bigger and more urgent. Our institution, we did studies for about 24 sectors, and it was very clear that it's always the same problems that have always been there that are emerging big. They're all institutional problems. They are all related to human capital. They're all related to governance. These are the areas that need a very serious tackling. Second point is there is an issue with the structure of the economies, particularly in the Arab world. They need serious diversification. There is limited growth in the productive sectors, particularly when we talk about manufacturing. You look at manufacturing and you find problems related to what's called the missing middle. We don't have enough small and medium enterprises. We have giant ones and workshops. The middle is actually quite weak. The products we produce are on the low value added side and on the low technological content. And this calls for serious, again, correction, i.e. serious industrial policy. Third point, foreign direct investment levels are very low. And right now there are actually opportunities for migrating investments from all over the world that our countries should capture. But this, of course, means incentives for attracting investment and much better conditions for efforts for digitalization. And for all of the above, we need to set priorities, because we cannot fix all problems, but we need to put our hands on the drivers of change, and these would differ from one country to the other to have the impact. On the side of the poor, talk about the poor, a lot of rhetoric around them, but very, very little action. I mean, water everywhere, but not a single drop to drink, literally. Okay, even when we give them cash, the cash support is not enough. We need sustainable solutions. In our region, we need to talk about universal basic income. We need to solve the problems of the informal sector, because that's the one that's accommodating all the poor. We need to look at small enterprises, and it's key that social policies as part of the economic policies, an integral part, not in isolation, not something that's done out of benevolence or something over and above. My last two words.
Yes, please continue. Really, the last few seconds. Otherwise, please. Thank you very much, Abla. I would like to move now to Dalwer. Please, your comments, and then we'll go and continue the discussion. Abla, I'll give you the floor again to continue later on. Please.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to all the hardworking, the team and the leader who brought us together despite circumstances. It's great talking to you again. We all have things in common, and we have our own specifics. So we have generic problems and challenges, and we have specifics. Everybody is now an expert on the generic ones, where COVID disrupted life, economies, societies, politics, and everything, which are now gradually coming back to some sort of normality. But COVID also reminded people of the structural and functional weaknesses that they may have, and we have plenty. So economy, public health, and other disruptions were all part of the big picture. But we also have our own specifics. This time last year, the whole of Iraq was in turmoil as a result of massive demonstrations that turned violent. Many people were killed. And the people were initially, at least, were simply asking for better life, prosperity, social justice, rule of law, equal opportunity, and so on. Whereas the authorities were trying to put a security and political picture on it, lived in denial and tried to suppress it. Whereas the real issues were to do with the failure of Iraq leaders to build a state, build a nation, tackle the main issues like diversifying the economy, creating jobs, and so on. As a single commodity country, rentier state, Iraq remained having these chronic problems. So then came COVID. With COVID, people were reacting very responsibly. Demonstrators decided to withdraw and calm things down. And that coincided with a change of government. So the government, the new government, was seen to be more sort of pro-reform, pro-change, in line with the demands of the demonstrators. But even this new government has failed to tackle the key structural and functional issues or problems and weaknesses in the entire governing system. So with the drop of oil price, with the shutdown of the economy and the global help with it, we now saw that Iraq is not only moving more towards fragility, but also it ran out of money, ran out of the ability to pay salaries. Divisions between Erbil and Baghdad widened. So it was a matter of time that with lack of action on reform, the demonstration would start again. And there they are in the south of Iraq and in Kurdistan. And again, very often the authorities try to deny the fact that this is to do with their inability to build a state and institutionalize and diversify the economy and so on. They blame it on COVID, on oil prices, and on politics. Of course, we have unique neighbors who are not adding to our stability, and we have a very awkward sort of political and security dynamics, plus the track record of not being able to manage them. So now the think tank has found it as an opportunity that for the first time, authorities, decision makers, legislators, and policymakers who were not listening before, we had real difficulty in getting them engaged and listening. Now they are more lost for ideas. They come to us. They try to engage us more. But while they have little money to spend on these ideas or on keeping the academic evidence-based policies really supporting them. So now the next 12 to 24 months, we have two big challenges. One of them, the government still has to reform, has to diversify the economy to deal with the lack of finances, trying to make ends meet. In the meantime, we are preparing for new elections, which would probably be end of 21 or early 22. But then again, the game is still the same old one. No dynamics has changed. And the leaders are very little focused or ill-focused on tackling the root cause of the problem. I stop here.
Unmute, Rim.
Yes, thank you very much, because it also echoes some of the issues that Amla mentioned. I would like to move straight away to Omar. Please, you have 4 minutes, and then we back to the discussion.
Thank you very much to TCSB and to Reem for inviting me to participate today. I was going to talk very briefly about the importance of openness in research with a special reference to the Gulf countries. So Jim earlier spoke about the Renaissance. I'll speak a little bit about the Enlightenment era. One of the key features of the Enlightenment era and one of the main reasons why there was such an increase in the production of science is because there was a common language for science and it became normal to exchange science across political boundaries. And this is something that also happened during the Islamic Golden Age when previously Greek works were translated into Arabic and to other languages, and a much broader pool of scientists were able to interact with the same material. This was the launch of the peer review system, and by the 21st century, we're all used to, as scholars, peer review and the importance of sharing our research and how important this is to increasing the quality of the final product. And moreover, not only does the improvement in quality happen during the peer review stage, even after we publish our results, we can all read each other's works. In fact, I've been recently, nice to meet Reem finally, because I've been recently citing a lot of her work in my own work, and that's been an important input to my own research. Now, in the Western world, Jim mentioned the primacy or supremacy, I should say, of Western think tanks in many domains. There is, generally speaking, a tendency towards openness in research in think tanks, just like there is in universities, and even sort of non-government institutions and think tanks are quite happy to publish their papers and urge their researchers to go to conferences, to share their papers, and so on and so forth. Even though think tanks are perhaps a little bit less open than academics, universities, they're still certainly far more open than what you'd find in the Middle East, which I'll come back to in a moment. And this is very important for quality. I'll give you a recent example for those familiar with an economics background. There's a couple of Harvard economists called Kenneth Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt, and they wrote a very important paper called Growth in the Time of Debt, which was used as a cornerstone, well, not necessarily a cornerstone, but certainly was influential in arguing for economic austerity in the wake of the global financial crisis in 2008. And they were happy to make their data available and their paper available. And a student from the University of Massachusetts and Amherst asked for the data, and he found that there was a problem, an error, a coding error in the Excel file. The results are a lot weaker than they expected. And this is very normal. These are the Harvard scientists. We shouldn't be saying, "Oh, what a bunch of idiotic researchers." This is normal. If Harvard researchers can make simple coding errors, then we can all make simple coding errors. And also, the way it was found is because they were open with their data. Now, in the era of Corona, as this conference is a testament to, and as you've all seen through your own disciplines, there's been a huge increase in the volume of research relating to Corona. And an important part of advancing the quality of that research, especially the interdisciplinary research, has been the ability to share it. So Neil Ferguson, who's the UK's epidemiology czar, he actually made a mistake. He was late in sharing his research, and when they shared it, found out there's a lot of flaws in that, which was underlying the government modelling. Now we move to the issue of the Gulf think tanks. In Gulf think tanks and Gulf research entities, there's a much lower propensity to share research. And they don't actually, in many cases, they produce research privately for the government and confidentially and don't share it. And I believe this is a mistake in some extent because it prevents that research from increasing quality due to peer review. There's a culture in the Gulf countries and in the Arab world more generally, but especially in the Gulf countries, of shying away from accountability in quality of research that is produced. And there's an fundamental underappreciation of the importance of sharing your research, presenting in conferences, and being open about what you're doing and how you're doing it, sharing the code for your models, sharing the details and the assumptions. And this is to the detriment of the quality. And this is one of the reasons why the research output of Gulf think tanks is so low in its citation rates and is not used as evidence in congressional hearings. And that's why Gulf experts are not called, that's one of the reasons why Gulf experts are not called to testify, and so on and so forth. So basically, in summary, what I would like to do is to alert Gulf-based researchers, whether they're in think tanks or governmental institutions or universities, to how the importance and the centrality of peer review and openness of sharing results and methods to improving the quality of research. And that if tenured professors at Harvard and if the leading epidemiologist in Europe can make simple coding errors, then you can as well. And the only way around that is for you to be open with the research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar, and all the other panelists. I have a few questions. In fact, the role of think tanks now in this COVID-19 period is very important. And Abla mentioned many policy recipes and policy recommendations to to deal with the problems, the structural problems. So in practice, what are the specific programs and actions that policy think tanks have done in your respective countries? For example, let's start with Abla. So you mentioned, so did they listen to what you have done? Do you have specific actions and programs that have been really, impacting, during this period of the COVID and all its ramifications on economic and social crisis, please?
Yes, Rem. What we did at the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies from the beginning of the crisis is actually produce series of studies, 3 series of studies. First one was about the impact of COVID-19 on the different sectors in details, making policy suggestions for the government on measures to overcome the crisis as it happens and address the institutional problems that are associated with those specific sectors. We've done that for around 20 sectors. This is one whole series, and it was sent to the government, it was actually sent to the president, and there were actions that were taken big time in all of them. The second series was in following up, because what we did also is put scenarios, future scenarios, for what is going to happen, because we started at the beginning, way at March. Right. So the second phase is actually to compare our scenarios to what actually happened and see the difference. And the third set is to identify the drivers of change that would revitalize the economy. From these, for instance, to have the role for women, you have the society, 18% in employment, all of them educated, and this is half the society. You have adopt different business models, like cooperative models, for instance, to use the small ones, to engage the young ones, to do the institutional reform, to have stages for institutional reform that can take place, among others. But there is one word that I want to say, that, and this is what I want to say as I finish. It cannot be done by countries by themselves. The international organizations need to interfere and help and remove debt so that our countries can survive and actually take action. Egypt, by the way, is affected like all the others. Egypt's fiscal year starts in July, and this is why this year we did not see the effect big time. The crisis affected us for only 3 months, but we are affected like everybody else.
Thank you very much, and this is extremely important, and also, it has to be continued, in fact, because, in fact, this pandemic is not over yet. What about you, Delware? What were the main actions that you thought your center or your research has contributed to during this period?
Rem, 2 minutes remaining.
So you have 1 minute. Oh, switch off.
Good allocation of resources.
Yes, 1 minute. I don't hear you. Please switch on your micro.
Okay, fine. Well, in 30 seconds, we did exactly what you just suggested, and that is take the opportunity to do more research, dig deeper into studying the structural and functional weaknesses, publish them, and now suddenly the politicians had enough time to read beyond 1 page, and now we are in demand, and people miss our conferences and public engagement, but more importantly, miss our reports. So we've been lucky in a way, having impact and influence through these communications that we, for the first time, had the chance to do. So more research, more publication, more engagement, and ready for the next phase of vaccine, post-COVID vaccine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Omar. You mentioned a very important matter, which is quality of research. I think we are stressed with time during COVID, and most probably sometimes you need to have already the quality put in place. So, of course, this is a structural problem. So what is your view about that? And what is your center?
We were fortunate to UNDP, the UNDP headquarters in New York, distributed grants to its offices across the world, and we partnered with UNDP Bahrain to use this grant to conduct a socioeconomic analysis of COVID in Bahrain. So we've been working with UNDP and merging our resources with them and producing a lot of reports, and that process is still ongoing. And that's been, and I invite everyone else to check with their local UNDP office if similar such activities are going on, because you should be able to contribute to them.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you, for this very interesting discussion. I think what is important is really open research, evidence-based and really independent, especially during this period of the crisis. Obviously, for the next step, it's important to do more research on pillars of resilience for all the economies to really resist to those types of external shocks. So I hand over to you, Jim. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you very much, and thanks to all of your panel members for their excellent examples. Clearly, as I indicated and Govind echoed and Alba echoed, many of the trends that we're seeing were in play, were in place, were happening within the region, but have accelerated. This acceleration has had a direct impact on those institutions that did not start in terms of policy relevance, engagement, digitalization. All of those trends, as has been discussed, have accelerated. Those institutions that did not launch those efforts before the crisis have been accelerated and will be either the transformer for those who we hope as a result of this forum will be engaged and begin the transformation process, or they will be the final part of this panel is COVID-19 effect, accelerator, transformer, terminator, what think tanks need to do survive. It is our obligation to help think tanks that have not begun the transformation process to provide the best practices and to help the community of think tanks in the Middle East strengthen their operations and to transform themselves so that they can be positioned to continue to serve the citizens and countries where they're located. I am pleased that the next panel is chaired by Dr. El President of the Emirates Policy Center, and I turn it over to her and her excellent panel who will explore the steps that they've taken to strengthen and transform their institutions.
Thank you, Jim, and thanks for your team and the great job you have been doing since the pandemic. Your energy, and you did not stop, you did not give up, and it ended with these excellent panels we have them. I only see one of my speakers. Calling Dr. Zaid Ayadat.
Emma, please do it. I think everyone is here.
They are? Okay. Great.
Yes. Their videos are, but they are here.
Azira from Morocco.
To leave the camera for us, please. From Turkey, if you can please close your camera so I can see my panelists, please. Okay. Well, good evening, good morning, wherever, good afternoon for everybody. And we're going to talk about the think tanks in the post-COVID-19 era. Of course, COVID-19 it's not about health only. It was a challenge for many aspects, politics, economy, psychology, so many aspects. But also, we as a think tank, we've been also trying to survive during this pandemic. I have with me prominent speakers and researchers. I have Dr. Adam Semeniski. He's the president of King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, and Dr. Ahmed Azirar. He's a professor in Moroccan Institute for Strategic Intelligence, Morocco, and Dr. Zaid Ayadat, director of Center for Strategic Studies in Jordan, and Dr. Nizar bin Saleh. He's research director for Maghreb Economic forum. Welcome, everybody. Here, I will moderate the session different than the others. I will not give 5 minutes for each of you. I will start bombarding you with the question. And if somebody has a comment on the question I am asking one speaker, feel free to add. Here, I will start with Dr. Adam. Dr. Adam, what is your assessment of the role of think tanks during COVID-19 crisis? Have they been able to reduce uncertainty with regards to the crisis? Have they been able to improve decision-making in facing the crisis and its various consequences? Have they proved to be of relevance to decision makers during the crisis? And you can talk about also your think tank here.
Okay, let me check that you can hear me, Dr. Ebtisam.
We do hear you.
Yes, good, very much. Thank you. Well, hello to everybody and salam alaikum to my friends in the region. Thank you, Dr. Ebtisam. And to Jim McGann, as everybody has said, is for his organization of the summit and the continuing support of the civil society's program and its welcome efforts on behalf of the global think tank community. In answer to your question, let me just address what we've done here at CAPSARC to try to deal with COVID-19. We've taken a number of practical steps to adapt and transform in the face of the pandemic and other developments that are affecting our environment. In early March of this year, before the lockdown started, we took a number of steps directly related to the pandemic. First, we began to implement an extensive set of office cleaning and sanitizing protocols to protect our employees. The next thing we did was we instituted a very liberal work-at-home policy. Third thing that we did is in anticipation of stricter rules on workplace, we worked with local telecom communities to dramatically increase our internet bandwidth. Earlier and throughout the crisis, we stepped up our cybersecurity training and practices. So these are some very practical things that we did in reaction to COVID. On the content side, in late 2019, as most of you know, CAPSARC and another Saudi think tank, King Faisal Center for Research in Islamic Studies, we were jointly appointed to co-chair the Think 20 engagement group during the Saudi G20 presidency. And CAPSARC's Vice President of Research, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki, the chairman of the T20, encouraged the addition of an 11th task force to deal specifically with the questions that you raised, Ebtisam. The new task force was aimed at framing the study issues linked to the pandemic and was organized to look at health, socioeconomics, markets and finance, multilateralism, and climate and the environment. The overarching goal was to consolidate the best thought leadership from around the world and many think tanks to provide practical courses of action. I want to just very quickly, and then I'll end, talk about the 5 general proposals or recommendations that the task force advocated, reaffirming the significance of health as a global public good and emphasizing the need for resiliency and preparedness. The second thing was promoting solidarity and multilateralism, calling on the G20 to reaffirm its commitment to cooperation across borders. Third thing was coordinating global economic policies to restore stability for the vulnerable among us, advocating that physical stimulus packages should prioritize the restoration of economic growth. Fourth, out of 5, creating the G20 Coalition for Transformative Education. You know, one thing that we found even here at CAPSARC is the negative impacts on students and homeschooling parents really do need to be addressed and ameliorated. And then finally, ensuring that the recovery policies emphasize climate neutral solutions. CAPSARC also played a role in providing the underlying research on the circular carbon economy framework that was endorsed. This was a relatively new thing, not too many endorsements recently at G20 summits. The integrated and holistic concept of the 4Rs was really advocated. Finally, and in closing, let me just say that we're doing two other things that I think are really important for everybody to think about. CAPSARC is an energy and resource think tank, and the COVID crisis had a huge impact on supply, demand, and prices of energy. CAPSARC's research was geared to address those issues. Internally, we're engaged in a bottoms-up effort to examine our research priorities and delivery capabilities to better align ourselves with national needs. And we want to remain as among the best providers of energy-related applied research, analysis, and data. We are really looking forward here at CAPSARC, Ebtisam, to use our capabilities to help incubate talent in Saudi Arabia and in the region for executing and formulating public policies in the natural resources and energy sector. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address that.
Thank you. Please, we'll have another round, and keep in your mind, we want also your future plan for the think tank. Dr. Zaid Ayadat, what are the major challenges that have faced think tanks as a result of COVID-19 crisis? What are the gaps and imperfections that crisis has revealed in think tanks and research industry?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ebtisam, for chairing this panel, and I'm delighted to be in with such a distinguished participants. And I also echo everyone else by thanking Jem again for excellent work in putting this together and the rest of the think tank summits. Now, in reflecting directly to the question you've raised, I think think tanks just found themselves in a stage of adaptation, if you wish. They've been profoundly challenged with the way they used to conduct their business, relying mostly on in-person physical presence, lack of technological infrastructure, and most importantly, the type of funds that they receive in order to execute the programs they have at hand. So in certain ways, COVID is redefining the way we conduct business, including think tank business. Meaning, it's just to speak to the title of the panel, it's actually accelerating the changes, the type of changes that might be introduced by technology, including, relying heavily on technology, on cyber issues, and also the use of the new data sciences, including artificial intelligence, in the models in the work we do. Now, of course, for example, the Center for Strategic Studies, CSS at Jordan, is well known for conducting polling and surveys. And that's been severely challenged. Actually, we were out of traditional way of doing business in terms of on-the-ground interview, personal interview, survey on public opinion studies. So we shifted to the online, and we shifted also to the overall of surveys. As we all know, these two other methods are important, but not as accurate, not as scientific, not as objective as the in-person interview survey research we used to do. And now, mind you, and this is, I guess, the most important challenges, whether within COVID-19, before or after, and it will continue with us, that facing the think tanks work in the world, but also particularly in the region, MENA region. And I'm referring here to Dr. Ebtisam, to the issue of sense of purpose. So what the think tank is supposed to be doing, what the purpose of their work is, to define the public debate, to set the agenda, to advise decision makers, to educate the public. So this sense of purpose and kind of lost sense of purpose is very important in my mind. Second issue is The way the think tanks type of work is defined globally by the leading think tank, if you wish, that started 100 years ago. In terms of the norms, in terms of the structure, in terms of the agenda. So the agenda is actually, one way or another, is not a democratic outcome. It's imposed in terms of its priority and in terms of its directions. Now, funding is a serious problem. And lacking the right amount of fund is a serious problem. Now, look, for example, what had happened to the most of the think tank in the region caused by the challenge caused by COVID-19, and I mean the shifting to the health issues and related health issues. Most of the think tank actually were out of business. They're doing nothing, and they have to adjust in terms of just doing something that is related one way or another to health. So these are issues, but more importantly, and I found this is very important in terms of the environment within which we operate, the red lines, the degree of freedoms think tank enjoys, whether they can really pursue issues. I'm referring to the region again, whether they can pursue certain type of issues and provide the ultimate objective analysis if they can or if they can't. Then, as you know more than anyone else, Dr. Sam, the problem of methodological challenges. We still belong to the past in terms of how science is done. And I think, all think tanks have to adapt one way or another to the new methodologies that are to be used in any policy research and strategic forecasting. Last but not least, I will refer also to the training of human resources. So human resources is the real problem we're facing in all our countries, in all MENA regions. Probably it is a global issue, but it is so concentrated, it's so intense in the region. It's barely possible to find an expert on certain public policies issues, or in forecasting, or in foresighting predictions, and etc. I will end by saying for now, and I'll keep the others for other things, for other round if there is, the issue of facts and opinion and information manipulation. That this is a serious issue as well, because think tanks tend to actually think of their opinion as facts. Now, we really need methodological rigor in order to differentiate between opinions and facts, and provide decision makers and the public intellects with the right facts and right analysis, and abandoning the idea, the right of experts versus the divine rights or other things. I think we have to also humble ourselves in the way we conduct our business and research. These are the issues that I really wanted to raise for now.
Excellent, Dr. Zaid. You are absolutely right. I think think tanks in the future, based on what we have been gone through this pandemic, need to reshape themselves, regenerate themselves, updating themselves. Maybe this is a question also I'm asking, what kind of think tanks we need in the future? Dr. Azirar, have think tanks been flexible and capable of overcoming obstacles arising from COVID-19 crisis? What are the benefits, gains, or opportunities that the crisis has brought to think tanks?
Hello, thank you, Mrs. Thank you, Mrs. Chairman, Dr. Ibtissam. Hello, colleagues. Hello, Dr. Jim, and thank you for the efforts you're deploying, your team as well. Thank you for inviting NIMIS, my think tank. To respond to your question, Chairwoman, I think that that was a problem, I think, for think tanks, the flexibility. You're right. We've seen sometimes all things as a society has been surprised, of course, by the pandemic, by the deepness of evolutions and rapidity of evolution of things in all items of our lives. So think tanks also have been very surprised, and I think the one who have been flexible, agile, have overcome, I think, this crisis and have adapted their strategy very rapidly, their methodologies and their funding also, so that to overcome and to come and to give some, of course, studies and also to be useful, of course, for the community as a whole. And I think you are right. The flexibility is one of the important qualities that think tanks have to have. We have, and many think tanks have taken time to react to that crucial and crisis. Also, we've seen a lack of coordination with other actors. It was not because everybody was busy and was very disturbed by the importance and the deepness of the crisis. Of course, there was also this crisis gave us lots of opportunities to gain. And the first one is mental change. To say everybody now is coming to see that the future will be under uncertainty, and we have to adapt, of course, our methods and our organization. Very rapid strategic. That's what we are living now in my think tank in EMIS, Moroccan Institute for Strategic Intelligence. We are now in reflection action to adapt our strategy. We are soliciting more and better links with policymakers. We are orienting our researchers to instant questions now, and especially for my think tanks, we are working on as we see them, useful sectors so that to restart our growth on a new basis and new opportunities that this crisis gave to us. We are working in some sectors, special sectors, agroalimentarian sector here in Morocco is very important, but also pharmaceutical. We are also seeing how to adapt for to the new organization of global sectors, of course. And now we are orienting ourselves to work.
Less than 2 minutes remaining.
Yes,
Okay.
I'll stick. Horizontally, but so vertically. I think we need here in Euromed region, I think a new partnership, because things are moving and we are now in the same needs in Africa than Europe. So we need a new cooperation, new partnership on new sectors and with a new methodology. That's to
Thank
say.
you. Thank you. Just because of the time, I will move to Dr. Nizar. Dr. Nizar, what should think tanks do to improve their capabilities in producing early forecasts of threats to human security? Should think tanks change their research agenda to include, from this day forward, non-conventional and transnational threats such as pandemics and effects of climate change?
Yeah, thank you, Tisam, and thank you, Jim, for making this happen, and everyone for the knowledge sharing. To answer your question, I mean, I'll go through a sample of what we did here in Tunisia during the pandemic and go forward with a proposition that MEF is trying to achieve post-pandemic. So basically, we need to understand that the global pandemic compelled the institution into the virtual world. So, and as a think tank based for us in a very sensitive political and social environment in a country going through an arduous democratic transition, MEF was pressured to adapt its strategy to fulfill needs and expectations presumed from a think tank. So the main decision was to transform all communications to online media outlets formats. That's one thing. The other thing that MEF tried to follow day-to-day and the action undertaken by governments to face the pandemic. Although overwhelmed by the fast pace, we decided to work in teams and focus more on actually collaborating with national stakeholders from civil society and the government in order for us to assist and support decisions based on our research and other think tanks' research and recommendations. So in Tunisia, civil society, I would say, and think tanks pushed the government to focus also on this social and economic aspect of the pandemic or of solution or beyond the pandemic, and not just the technicality of a global health crisis, which makes sense for think tank to, in terms of recommending actually and assisting decisions related to the pandemic. And I mean, what we are trying to do next, since the pandemic is temporary, the research department actually developed the crisis policy bundle, which is a matrix of policy reforms related to crisis management and alternative government or alternative governance, such as policies on online communication reform, crisis communication policy, unilateral and multilateral cooperation. This matrix actually is set to evaluate the national strategies to overcome such a pandemic or an other emergency, to comprehensively analyze the undertaken plans in terms of governance, and I mean, in other words, evaluating and analyzing new tools to be used by decision makers to function in similar situations. So the main result that MEF would like to have, and actually we're inviting all think tanks around the world to do the same, is to achieve and develop a set of policy recommendations to be discussed and considered by decision makers in crises like this one we're going through. We were surprised by COVID-19. So as a think tank, and also as institutions in a functional government, we were overwhelmed by the pace of this pandemic. And and we think that if governments and international communities had a plan to face such emergencies, I mean, the effect would be reduced significantly. The crisis policy bundle, we called the crisis policy bundle, would be the worst case scenario governing plan, and would not be exclusive to one country. It's a multilateral strategy that can be also used in other situations where I mean, the international community is overwhelmed by the fast pace of changes.
Sure, Jim, how many time still we have?
I can tell you in 1 second.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm finishing soon.
For you, for the panel.
You have until 10:15.
I mean, no, it's our time. How many minutes? Because different between us and you.
You have 6 or 7 minutes.
Okay, please, my panelists, let us try to finish within that. So please keep yourself brief. I'll move now to Dr. Adam. Dr. Adam, this is the second round of question. So how can think tanks play a role in enhancing worldwide networking to help forecast and collective face transnational threats and challenges?
Right. I think that the way to do that, Ebtisam, is to continue to have joint meetings like the one we're having today so that we all can stay on the same page and communicate with each other on the important issues. I think this is very important, and I would love to see the Think 20 engagement group for the G20 formalized in some way, and I know Jim and others have been working very hard on that. Thank you.
Very good, very good. And I think also learning from each other's in terms of experiences. Dr. Zaid, what are the initial features of a proposed roadmap for the function of think tanks in the post-COVID-19 era, either at the level of internal policies in health, education, social and security areas, or at the level of international relations, foreign policy, and state power building in its holistic sense?
Well, again, thank you very much, but this is a very important question. And, you know, in adding to what my colleagues been saying about the role and the roadmap for future, I think one major issue has to do with redefining the way we conduct business. In particular, in those issues of public sectors you're referring to, public policy forums and public policies in the region suffer of lack of expertise and enough good research on how to provide decision makers and the public with a factual analysis and a more scientific, objective analysis of the situations. Take, for example, what's happening now in the health sector, what to do and not to do, what to do with education, what to do with the migration, what to do with the and the rest of that. But more importantly, I think the three issues of freedom, access, and resources will be the determinants of the roadmap of the think tank in the region and probably globally. So to what extent our think tanks enjoy freedom to do what they want to do? How much of access do they have to the experts, to the data, and to the decision makers, and of course to the public? And the third, of course, it is, as I said, resources in terms of financial and material resources and human resources as well. These are the three determinants of the future roadmap of the think tank work.
Thank you, Dr. Zaid. Dr. Azrar, how will lessons learned from COVID-19 crisis affect reorienting the priorities and resources of think tanks? What are the main relevant changes, research methodologies, and thinking approach that think tanks and research industry should take into consideration in post-COVID-19 era?
Definitely, yes. We have to adapt our methodology.
Yeah.
Definitely, yes, I said, Dr. Ebtisam. I think we have to adapt our strategies and our vision to the future so that our forecasts must be more efficient. So this is relating to the networking of think tanks. Let me say also that think tank and civil society have to have a much more visible place in the system of the United Nations. We have also to have a structured financing. That's to say, transnational financing, but also local, of course. More linkages with firms, with the economy, with the complete economy, enterprises. That's that, and also I think there's lots of things which are to be done by think tank itself, like sharing databases. We have to collaborate much more and to tie our working and to co-work much more on specific and important subjects and themes which are transnational, like those which pandemics have shown very well. We have also to have structured funding, I think, locally, and I think also the importance of life or sectors of life economy have to be now the priorities for all think tanks. In our think tank, as an example, we are now relooking our agenda missions so that they fit post-COVID needs, mobilizing new members, volunteers and partners, especially young actors, women in new fields. Second, we are developing new active networking to facilitate achieving the new objective of our agenda, which is relating to the post-COVID, of course, problems. Creating new kind.
Thank you. Very good. Dr. Nizar, how can we create a fruitful relation and achieve a perfect coordination between think tanks and governments to ensure that the role of these think tanks become transformational one? How can we do that?
One of the issues in some regions in the MENA region is that advocacy is missing at some point. Access to decision makers and governments is becoming harder from a year to a year. So basically creating a platform between both sides, decision makers and think tanks, that would help actually advocate for recommendations and researches done by think tanks. One other thing we need to think about when it comes to think tanks is that we need to become more resilient and to create a resilience mechanism in terms of how to deal with changing governments in some countries. Like for us in Tunisia, the government is changing so fast that you don't even have a contact point at some point. You're losing your contact point when it comes to advocating for one recommendation to decision makers. Having a platform where we share all research and all recommendations to the government, that would help immensely in sharing and advocating for policies. Yeah.
Less than 2 minutes remaining.
Less than 2 minutes. I will give each one of them half minutes to say the last word. I will start with Dr. Adam, and the last thing you want to say in 1 sentence in terms of the role of the think tanks in the future. What is the most important you think from your point of view?
Let's all work with the Italian presidency and the Italian G20 to continue our dialogue and drive this forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Zaid.
I think the crisis has accelerated existing trends in the work of think tanks, certainly transformed some of the most successful ones, and terminated those who are not belonging to the future.
Excellent. Dr. Ahmed Azira.
Hopefully, I think the pandemic showed that many reforms which seemed impossible before are relatively easy to achieve, like new technical local production. We've seen that in Morocco. Agility of firms, digital shift, including in social governance of the urgent needs of the population. I think we have to profit by this. COVID has been very, very hard and tough for people, but we are to profit of this new era. Thank you.
Dr. Nizar?
Yeah, simply let's just focus on next steps with think tanks collaboration. Yeah.
Right. Thank you all, and I hope we learned that was a strategic shock, COVID-19, and we have to prepare ourselves that we might have more like that, and think tank should survive this and should change their role. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, my speaker. It was an excellent panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Estasam, as usual, a command and masterful performance in managing this excellent panel and keeping them both focused and on time. Thank you very, very much. We now move to the session on the post-pandemic era, and will it usher in, and I might suggest that it is already occurring, a renaissance, and will assess the potential for that renaissance. And I have an excellent panel to assess and sort of talk about what things have already occurred in terms of responses that suggest the renaissance, and what is potentially in the offing. And this is not just on the Middle East, it is around the world, and certainly in the United States, where certainly in the United States, where the implications of COVID-19 are very clear, and hopefully we will build forward better as a result of the crisis. So I now turn to our panel, first to Sayem Dressi, Executive Manager, Strategic Fikr Center for Studies in Turkey. Sayem.
Hello, thanks. My name is Sayem Dressi, speaking on behalf of Strategic Fikr Center for Study. Of course, it is great for me and for my center to be with all of you up here. I'm going today to talk here about all from an optimistic perspective about the post-pandemic era. After a decade of political instability and a radical transformation, maybe the COVID-19 pandemic represented an additional negative shock to the already fragile situation in the MENA region, but also can be considered to some extent an opportunity for future positive change. For me, there are at least 3 factors to bear in mind, and that the MENA government can build on to invest in a comprehensive process of renaissance. I'm going to talk about how society actors can make the difference and how the emergence of a civic engagement and digitalization in the post-pandemic era can also lead to a positive change in the future. The first factor I'm talking about is the return, of a strong and active civil society, especially when we're zooming into the case study of Tunisia and the Lebanon. There is a return, again, of the union and human rights, and especially the Feminist Association in Tunisia, Lebanon, and of course in Algeria, and as an active actor during the ongoing COVID-19 crisis. They have made efforts to facilitate governmental receptive measures. For that, in the governance space, this COVID pandemic has given more legitimacy and strength for the feminist and the human rights organization, especially in Tunisia and Lebanon, to initiate an institutional dialogue about the social contrast, social equality, gender-based violence. For me, this coronavirus crisis can be used as an opportunity not only to push policymakers to think about new realistic socio-economic policies that cut with the corruption, poverty, and unemployment, but also to go beyond their closed networks of clientelism and identity politics. The civil society push this political elite to cut with this identity polarization, such as in Tunisia, Islamist and secularist, in even within the Shiites in Iraq, and of course the problem in Lebanon. My point here is that solidarity between these different actors maybe can create the first steps in the process or the road of a renaissance, which I can call the civil project that can unite between civil society organization, activists on the ground or online, and intellectual elite, and the different actors who believe in such transformative change will create a strong opposition front against this system. The second factor is the successive waves of activism that have emerged in the last decade and intensified in these last months in Lebanon and Algeria, and of course Tunisia and Sudan, and of course and Iran, will construct the mentality of a civil resistance and a change in the collective consciousness, because there will be no renaissance without a right-based approach or a civic engagement or political participation. But it is important to mention one thing here, which is significant, that since 2011, all Middle East countries have undergone successive waves of protests on the ground or online, but without great success. Yes, but still anger protests are still struggling for the socio-economic justice, democratization, equality, and even jobs. Here, I just want to emphasize that the idea that the emergence of a civil movement is itself very recent in the MENA region, but many of them have a problem of leadership, organization, and a frustrated relation with the political elite. But the essential situation is that masses of citizens have reached the point of political consciousness that challenge their status in the post-COVID-19 era, and started in Lebanon and Tunisia. It is the tactic for change in non-violent ways with a new slogan. This slogan are acting beyond the ideology, beyond the identity politics and polarization. The third factor that government can build on and facilitate transformative change toward the Renaissance is this growing governmental and private sector investment in digitalization during the pandemic crisis. We find on the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, the Qatar and the Emirates, long-term national plans toward technology and innovation, where startup sector and the knowledge-based economy create success and benefit. And so there are new realities beginning to emerge with telemedicine in Tunisia and Lebanon, and of course in the other MENA country, online learning, training, remote work across the region. So being digital is the new design principle for rebuilding education, employment, health system in a way that allows government to be more resilient and receptive for transparency, accountability, and of course the rule of law. In the end, it is legitimate to ask the following question: since the Arab country is still full of contradiction, what can be done? What is the next? So we have an active civil society. The beginning of a civil engagement, digitalization are necessary but not enough to create a renaissance. In a context where no reform-minded leaders are still the policy makers, where agenda and the social discrimination, of course, poverty, corruption, and unemployment are still institutionalized. And of course, the main point is where intellectual elite, these philosopher, critical thinkers, academic or writer, are still absent. And this stems from the mass and the street. Many thanks for you.
Wonderful. I greatly appreciate your very optimistic comments and your specific examples in terms of technology and the renaissance that is already underway. We now turn to the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel. Ari Feinstein.
Hi, so I'm glad to be with all of you today. Unfortunately, Amos was unable to join as he had planned. He had a family emergency and is now with his father in the hospital. But I'm happy to be here with you today, and I'm happy to speak about the subject of the panel, which is the idea of sort of building back better in the Middle East. And I think that one of the main points here is that whether the pandemic leads to a more stable and secure Middle East or a more fragmented and unstable region will depend in part on the decisions our governments make. As think tanks, it is our responsibility to advise courses of action with long-term vision to ensure the future of the people in our respective countries. To my mind, the two major effects of COVID-19 crisis on the region are the collapse of the oil market, which was a primary source of revenue for many states, and the inward turn that many countries took to focus on their own problems at home. In light of the transnational nature of the health and economic crises, which could have aftershocks for many years to come, focusing on the problems at home is important, but it is not enough. We saw some states take this crisis as an opportunity to improve cooperation with regional partners, and to work on the vaccine and promote economic collaboration. In particular, it is worth mentioning that the UAE and Bahrain have made bold and important steps of formalizing relations and building cooperation with Israel. As an Israeli, I hope the steps taken toward normalization are just the beginning, and that it creates a foundation for more inclusive regional cooperation groups. The pandemic is the first challenge we can tackle together, but I think it could create a framework that can be repurposed for other needs, including maritime security in the Red Sea, public health in the region more generally, and the long list of unfortunate problems which plague our region. It is also possible, of course, that events will move in the opposite direction. Dismal economic times and fear can ignite old hatreds and cause people to seek scapegoats. The long-standing scapegoat for the Middle East has been Israel. For decades, people have blamed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for the region's problems. Given the scale of what is happening in places now like Syria and Yemen, it is now apparent that the Middle East problems are far bigger than that. I think that this pandemic is an opportunity to recognize that things in the Middle East are not a zero-sum game, and what is good for you can be good for me and vice versa. On that note, I think it is worth considering the value of an ongoing working group which is inclusive, where we can work together to tackle some of the region's problems in a way that yields dividends to all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Once again, I was not expecting an optimistic set of comments from this panel, but it is very welcome in this very trying and dismal times in which we live. I now turn to Dalia Saida, Director of Liberal Democratic Institute in Egypt. Dalia. You're muted.
Hello, Jim.
There we go.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay,
thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. This is my first time on the summit, so thank you for this opportunity, and I hope it won't be the last. So speaking about optimism, actually this pandemic, as tragic, of course, as it is, it brought a lot of optimism to when it comes to changing politics and new systems of governance to the region. So it might not be surprising to see many people optimistic about the future of the region after this pandemic. And the reason for that is that actually our governments, for the first time found themselves alone facing the pandemic. Unlike before, they always depended on their correlations but because of correlations and foreign affairs, and also creating maybe an external enemy to keep their own people silent on certain issues. But for the first time, they found themselves face to face with the problem. Because as you all know, there was a curfew, a complete lockdown, and countries had to close their borders. So out of this, or in the process, the relationship between the citizen and the state or the government has been redefined in several ways that will positively affect the political future of the region, if not the whole world. So a number of observations came out of this. Number one, I agree with what my colleague here, Siham, mentioned about citizens and expanding wider. Also, I would add that civil society, especially in countries that has gone through the Arab Spring, like Egypt, Tunisia, and other countries, for so long has been only focusing on political issues, political activism, but not very much focusing on social and economic issues, engaging with the grassroots citizens. Thanks to the pandemic, this story has changed, and the civil society has become more engaged with grassroots citizens on issues that are immediately relevant to them. And this also helped put the civil society under a new light for the government. Now the government look at them as civil society organizations, as partners, not a political challenge, as was the case before. The second observation, which is very ironic actually, is that the countries that are more illiberal and more non-democratic, maybe or non-democratic governments in the whole world, not only in our region, were much better in fighting the battle with the coronavirus and the pandemic and its economic consequences. Perhaps because these governments have much stronger control on private sector businesses and individual citizens, and most of the wealth of the country is under their control. Another interesting observation, a positive observation that came out of this pandemic is that the way the government is now looking at human rights issues, at least since the Arab Spring revolutions that erupted in 2010, the focus was mainly on political and civil rights as transnational human rights issues. In contrast, economic and social rights such as healthcare, education, and housing have always been viewed as internal issues that each country should work or reform on its own. But thanks to the pandemic, economic and social rights are now becoming a transnational, transborder issues that countries can cooperate and work on together. As we have seen, for example, in the exchange of medical supplies and medical technology between countries in the past few months. Another also interesting step forward is how this pandemic redefined the relationship or the role of the military within the civil state. For so long, the debate has been going on issues like what are the non-traditional or the limits of the non-traditional roles of militaries or the military institution in the political and economic life of a country, how the armed forces can play within the civil state, whether it should be a democratic or civilian control over armed forces, or the armed forces can keep a state of autonomy. This debate has been going for so long, especially in countries like Egypt, where the armed forces is an independent institution. But actually, the pandemic put this debate to test and proved that this autonomy can be beneficial and not a threat to the private sector or to market economy, as some has claimed in the past. As we have seen, the private sector at the beginning of the pandemic, at least in Egypt, hesitated to help the government and tried to practice monopoly over food and medical commodities and use the need of the people. At that moment, the armed forces and its affiliated factories, food and medical factories, intervened to provide a parallel arrangement ready to satisfy people's needs and force the private sector to cooperate. And it succeeded. So the final point also here is that makes us very looking very positively at this pandemic and its consequences is the use of technologies that has been everywhere, not only on government level, but also on educational health issues and also in elections. We had parliamentary elections in Egypt this year, and the use, if the candidates and political parties depended heavily on information technology and social media to communicate with their voters. And thanks to that, many of the corrupt practices that used to happen in elections, in public gatherings that happened before the voting day disappeared. So maybe this is a positive thing that will help improve the electoral and democratic process in the future. So overall, I think a lot of political changes are expected from this crisis and this pandemic, and most of them are positive.
Wonderful, Dolly. I'll take this opportunity to point out that one, this will not be it may be your first, but will not be your last appearance. In terms of the objective that is, I hope, apparent in terms of all of the panels, I make a very conscious effort so that there is gender diversity, political diversity, regional diversity, institutional type diversity, and new and established. I don't say old think tanks, I say new and more established think tanks. And it is through that, I think, that we have a rich discussion. And both you and CM have contributed mightily to this panel, and I want to thank you for joining us and making your contributions. I now turn to our final speaker, Karim Al-Nawi, President of the Policy Center for the New South in Morocco. Karim?
Yes, Jim, I'm here.
Okay. The floor is yours.
I cannot see myself, but I will start.
We can see you, and we can see the banner for the Policy Center for the New South behind you. So all is well. So you're ready to go.
Alhamdulillah. Many thanks, Jim, and it's always a pleasure to be with you and the large group that you orchestrate and organize with a great maestria, making sure that the very subtle equilibrium, as you just mentioned, are respected, and I think it's important. Geography, gender, etc. So let me share very quickly, since we don't have much time, what we try to answer the question you asked us. And you've been saying this several times. Is it a renaissance moment? Is it are we waiting for a deus ex machina? Is it a sort of a starting point of a new era? I don't think history works this way, Jim, unfortunately. At the scale of our lives, change is slow, and the weight of history is there, and I more believe in evolution than in revolutions, in human evolutions. You take a long-term perspective. But what I share with you is that we probably at a critical juncture. We're probably in a sort of crossroad, and depending on our action, we will turn right or left, or we continue on the same path. So at some point in time, there are curves, there are situations we need to negotiate. There are critical nodes, critical junctures, non-linearities, which are familiar to mathematicians and economists. And I think a lot of what we do now will shape our near-term future or long-term future. And without any doubt, we are at a sort of moment where there's a collision of different sort of complex evolution, climate being one. I think the heightened uncertainty, the interdependency of the world, the very complex intrication of issues, and it's not, just saying it. I think this is very true, particularly in the Middle East, where the weight of history is there, the complexity of the situation is there, and I think this is where we come in, and this is maybe modestly our contribution as think tanks. I think, but in the end, it is very important. It's the capacity of our community to maintain dialogue with shared values. And I think it is very important as think tanks. We share values. We believe in scientific work. We believe in analytical work, in empirical work. We believe in facts. And we believe in dialogue with respect and tolerance and openness, being able to listen to others. And I think in this kind of situation where, there's uncertainty, there's variability, there is a complex horizon that is not very well clear so far, it is very important to densify, to intensify our dialogue. And from this dialogue, we come up solutions. So if I have a recommendation to do, rather than coming up with a specific solution, I think it is how collectively, as think tanks, we can create a safe space, a place where we listen to each other, we're able to shape public policies at the domestic level, but also at the global level, at the regional level, to be listened to our, for the policy makers that in the end decide, but also more largely to the general public. And let's not underestimate the value of this. I think it is very important, and particularly you, Jim, also, you've been bringing your piece to that, which is by sort of entertaining, by taking care of this community, nurturing this community. It is a public good, this platform, this space for dialogue, and I think the values are central to what gathered us as think tanks. Is certainly the values we share, we defend, our values at the Policy Center for the New Site, and we will remain available for all kinds of initiatives within that spirit, and trying also to see if we can make this moment a renaissance, as you mentioned in the title of this panel. So thank you for having me, and my best wishes for the next year if we don't see each other before.
All right, Kareem, I'd like to close the panel with a 30-second lightning round for each panelist. Starting with Siam, in terms of one thing that where you see most possible in terms of a potential renaissance in the Middle East. So each panel, 30 seconds in terms of this. And then Kareem, in terms of, you remind me of myself in terms of my interns. While you're younger than I am, the panel is well balanced with the optimist of youth in terms of Dalia, Siam, and Ari, and then there are the two of us who are the balancer in terms of the world in which we live. My interns continually remind me of and urge me and underscore the importance of optimism. So a lightning round, starting with Siam, in terms of what you see as possible. One thing, a bright spot in terms of potential renaissance.
Yes, many thanks, again. Yes, from my optimistic perspective, that we can start with a problem here in, especially Lebanon and Tunisia, which I think, even the political system is living an existential crisis. There is no charismatic leaders or political elite, no confidence in this politician. And so now this politician can't lead, this period or this post-pandemic era that can't lead their masses, into this transformative change. What we need, from my optimistic perspective, that which we call the solidarity, this opposition front, of civil society, and especially I zoom in the role, the role of intellectual elite, these critical thinkers. We have seen in the COVID-19, in this period of 10 months, many scholars, many researchers, especially in the social science and like that, it is the time, for this intellectual elite to invest, in their knowledge and to contact the masses. It is very important to say here, the Arab world, they use, the social media. They follow, yes.
We have
yes, just one
quickly,
sentence.
yes. Quickly, Dalia, Ari, and Kareem. We have to move on. We have the final session.
So the best thing, yeah, sure. So the best thing in general is redefining the relationship between the government and the people. The government is not mama and papa anymore, but a manager, and the citizen is more active and more engaged and looked at as a partner, not as a subject.
Great. Ari, are you still with us?
I am still with you, Jim. So my optimistic take is that this could lead to a change in worldview among the general population of the region. I hope and think that it could lead to greater awareness of collective goods and away from the approach of zero-sum national or religious cleavages. I hope that this could be the impetus for changes of approaching things like, obviously regional conflicts, but even bigger like more long-term issues like climate change. Thank you.
Wonderful. Kareem.
Well, thank you, Jim. That's why we need to have more younger people around the table for decisions. So I fully agree with you. That's what we call collective intelligence, and it's part most, undoubtedly of the solution. So I would say invest in the younger generation, invest in education, and particularly open spaces for them. They have something that is a decreasing function of age, which is called energy, Jim. And to make change happen, you need energy, and the energy is, of course, they have more energy. The younger you have more energy you have. And I can tell you, in my managerial experience, it works at a national, global level. There's no reason it shouldn't. Let me say hello to my friend Paolo that I can see here.
Okay, thank you. Young and mature members of the panel for your wonderful interventions, ideas, and the Renaissance is real. I now have the great pleasure of turning over to the final panel that will look at making the T20 fit for an uncertain future. We have an excellent panel and an excellent and able chair in Abla Adel Latif, Executive Director of the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies. Abla, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. This is the last session, and actually it's extremely important. The best way to take think tanks' opinions to the international community for implementation is T20. T20 is the route, the link between T20 and G20. And the title of the session, I think, best fits the question to ask: with what can T20 do in order to accommodate or to do a better job in this uncertain future. There is no better panel than the one that we're having. We have excellent contributors. We have the most recent experience with T20 in the Saudi Arabia 2020. We have Fahd al-Turki, Vice President and Head of Research in CAPSTARC, and who did a great job in in G20, of which I've had the pleasure of being one of the co-chairs in the sessions and also a writer of one of their policy briefs. And we have the newcomers. So we have the most recent and the newcomer. What can we possibly do better than that? We have Paolo Magri, the Executive Vice President of ISPI, my good friend. Very glad that you're here, the Italian Institute for International Policy Studies. And we also have with us the Turkish experience by Guven Sak, the director of the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, TEPAV. The time allocated to this session seems to be shorter than the others. Each one of you, please, 4 minutes. I'll try to be as harsh as Jim has been, because we need also 2 minutes at the end for a good discussion. All right, please, Fahad, please go ahead and start. 4 minutes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Abla. Try to be as short as possible to give more room to my colleague Paolo, because that's where the future is. Thank you for hosting me, and thanks, Jim, for inviting me to speak on this important panel and important session. And inshallah, soon we will meet in person for the Middle East and North Africa Summit next year. To everybody, good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are in the world. It gives me a great pleasure to connect with you virtually today. As Abla mentioned, we have just concluded the Saudi G20 presidency and the T20, and we can finally now look back and see it from afar. We have started the T20 summit with a strong hope and a bold vision, which have guided us throughout the year, which is creating a future of prosperity, sustainability, and inclusion for all. One important point that was highlighted by previous panels is that today's challenges within G20 and outside G20 are not limited to the borders of these countries. So both the indications and the solutions require multilateral or a global approach. So therefore, we need as think tanks to think beyond our area. We go outside and we engage with the rest of the think tanks around the globe. And many actually think tanks in the G20 are reaching beyond the borders of the G20 in terms of both scope as well as activity. In the T20, we reaffirmed the need for multilateralism and the key role of international organizations to overcome our existing shared global challenges of multilateralism, especially during the year 2020 on the onset of the COVID-19 as a backdrop. In fulfilling our inclusivity agenda, T20 was determined to reach out to every corner of this world, to reach out and get the voice of these think tanks through our policy briefs. We have an impressive global coverage of over 650 authors from 77 countries.
2 minutes, my friend. Okay, so it's not me, it's Jim.
Let me then turn to the issues related to the MENA region. We have highlighted a number of recommendations in the MENA. So on the issue of climate and climate challenge, and we noted as the world adjusts to a new norm, we discussed the importance of creating circular recovery and advancing the carbon management for supporting climate action. And the region always here in the Middle East and North Africa suffers from the scarcity of resources. And we have discussed these challenges related to food, energy, and water, sustainability, affordability, and accessibility. Now, next, and beyond. We have discussed issues and raised recommendations on social cohesion, which is an important foundation, and it was highlighted by the previous panel as well. Lays the foundation of health for nations. We have recommended holistic.
We need to close at this point.
Okay, so let me close by highlighting the MENA region participation, which I think we should continue to promote into the Italian T20. We're glad to see 178 authors participating from the MENA region, and we encourage more to come and continue engagement with Italy. There are a number of countries in Africa. 10 countries only in Africa participated in T20 Saudi Arabia, and we look forward to see more. One of the main advantages of the T20 and participation in the T20 is the ability to adopt the recommendations that are put forward to the G20. In that context, 48 of the policy recommendations that were promoted by T20 last year were adopted fully or partially by the G20. With that, I will close and turn the mic back to you, Abla.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paolo. Please, you're the new guy with the adventure. You're holding the gun now. Let's see what you're gonna do.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, Abla. I'm sure you all noticed that Fahad looks more relaxed and younger since he eventually and finally can look back to the T20 while I have to look ahead to the T20. I will make 3 short points. The first one, can we hope in a revival of international cooperation? COVID-19 has further emphasized that the need for cooperation is there, and on paper the will could be there as well, with Joe Biden at the White House. So let's follow Jim's in turn request. Let's be optimistic for a while and see the glass half full. Second point, but if the need and will are inshallah there, what about the G20? The my country first narrative has inevitably affected also the G20, increasing uneasiness toward it. For some, the critical issue is the format. For others, is the way the G20 operate and its agenda. Among those skeptical about the format, for some, the G20 is too large to be relevant and propose to go back to the G7 or move toward a D10, basically with a crystal clear message, keep China and others out. Others think that the G20 is on the contrary too small and not representative enough of the collective will of the world. They have in mind a resurrected General Assembly of the United Nations. These two views are at odds, but they both tap into the same uneasiness with the G20 format, be it a problem of representation, it leaves many countries out, or one of effectiveness, it has too many countries in. While acknowledging this uneasiness, we have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The G20 has been and still remain the only attempt to take a color photo of today's world instead of a 75-year-old black and white photo, the General Assembly, or the fading photo taken 40 years ago, the G7. Revision are therefore more needed in the way the G20 operates than in its format and composition. I will mention 3 revisions which Fahad has raised several times. 1, streamline the agenda. 2, reinforce the Troika. 3, real engagement of engagement groups. So what for the Italian T20?
Less
As the
than 2
national
minutes
coordinator and chair of the Italian T20, ISPI will do its best to 1, prioritize the usually wide agenda by focusing on 3 Ps, inevitable Ps, people, planet, prosperity. We'll do our best to get the utmost out of the richness of visions produced by our think tanks community, facilitating, budget and pandemic permitting, the widest possible participation of think tanks from non-G20 countries. This is particularly relevant for the MENA region and Africa. Both will be central, as Fahad said, in many topics addressed by the summit, but only 3 countries are formally invited. For this purpose, with Jim and his program at Penn University, we have also planned 2 town halls meeting to widen up contribution to the task force activities. Third, we will do our best to work actively with the Troika, incorporating as much as possible the advice from our Saudi friends and involving as soon as possible Indonesia. Fourth, we will do our best to stimulate a debate on reforming and improving G20 T20 through a specific task force which will involve former and future T20 national coordinators and chairs. We will need your help. We look forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Thank you for being specific and abiding also by time. Now we hear from Guven Sak.
Yeah, let me be very brief. Seeing Jim over there, let me be very brief. In 2015, during the Turkish presidency, he at TEPAB led the T20 process, and that's when T20 has started to become more structured, more inclusive, and more representative in all the discussions. So when in this situation that we are in, where we have a purely global problem, and that requires global cooperation, I think G20, if there is going to be any globalization from here to the future, I think G20 is of utmost importance. And when we look at how we can get out of this mess in general, I think it is possible to identify a few points. One is that the public sector, public intervention is going to be of utmost importance. Public investments, public everything is going to be important. So I think in this environment, public-private sector dialogue is of utmost importance in order to make use of this opportunity. I mean, I got all those messages from the youngsters that we tell you, Jim, the positive messages. So I think this is a period where think tanks, where we all need to get out of our trenches and focus on this cooperation issue and find ways to improve public-private sector dialogue, I think. So let me stop here.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. Before ending, I'm going to use not 30 seconds, in 10 seconds each, a question for each one. If you are to mention one item, only one action that can be done to improve the performance of T20, what would it be? And I'm asking all three of you, and then I'm asking Jim as well. I'm using the fact that I'm chairing the session to ask Jim at the end as well, and then take him smooth to the concluding session. So please, Fahad, one
very
action.
short. Work with the T20, work with Paolo, work with the next presidencies as well. That's the best platform.
That's enough. It was one word. Paolo.
Streamline the agenda.
He's tougher than I am.
Yeah.
Debating the state of the world.
That's it. Streamline the agenda. Guven.
Okay. Finished.
I do agree with Paolo, but let me add that, in order to make this global policy debate, I think we need to make this process more inclusive, more representative. Let me say this.
Habla is
Jim,
tougher than Jim. Habla is tougher than Jim. We have a my God.
You need moderators like this, Paolo. You need moderators like her.
I speak with fear. I speak quickly. One, I think it would be beneficial for the T20 to establish a global inclusive governing board that is in keeping with the principles of the G20 and best practices for INGOs. Two, create a rotating secretariat every 3 years with the members of the G20. Three, mobilize resources to bring and make more inclusive countries from the South. They will come if the resources are there. A commitment should be made to do that. Finally, easily addressed in terms of the inclusiveness is to include the AU as a member of the G20. It is, to me, unconscionable that the European Union with 27 countries has a seat and Africa with 54 does not. Those are simple things that can take place to make the G20 and T20 more inclusive and responsive. In closing,
thank you, Jim. I pass it to you now for the closing. Go ahead.
Time over.
I just want to say
Thank you,
that the richness and the value of the think tanks in the MENA region was incredibly on display this morning throughout this program. And I want to report that the Global and MENA Summit and the Global Summit for the first time will be in MENA next October in Bahrain. Additionally, I would say in terms of what is reflected in all of the comments, and that we have to help not only as a community and make the MENA think tank network a reality, especially in the region. When I asked the question, what is the greatest value added by think tanks? The response was track 2 discussions. Clearly, there is no other region where those discussions are more important than the MENA region. We are at, and I'm realizing that cliches take on meaning in crisis. We are at, as the cliche says, the darkest hour before the dawn. It is very optimistic at this moment that the end of this plague is here, is upon us. The darkest hours, however, will be the next 3 months. And our institutions and our optimism must remain throughout. We must, as is reflected in all of the comments and what I have said repeatedly in these summits, think tanks must be smarter, better, faster, more digital, and more agile. The reality is big ships turn slowly and think very fast. And so we need to make our institutions more agile, innovative, and responsive. I want to thank all of the panelists, all of the members of the advisory committee, and help us make the Middle East and Global Summit in Bahrain in October the best summit yet. Thank you all and have a great weekend. And I want to thank you for staying late on a Friday for this important meeting. Have a great weekend.